Good evening, friends, and welcome to the inaugural college lecture. I'm delighted to see every one of you here tonight. Thank you ever so much for coming. My name is Sarah Prescott, and I'm the Dean and Principal of the College of Arts and Humanities here at UCD. Before passing over to Associate Professor Regina Echolatan, who will introduce our speaker for this evening, I want to say a few words about the concept and purpose of the annual college lecture for UCD Arts and Humanities. The college lecture was primarily conceived as an annual celebration of the arts and humanities at UCD, and it's that word celebration that's important. I think we live in a time in which it is increasingly important to celebrate the arts and humanities, their value, their relevance, their impact. So it's in this spirit that the lecture was conceived as an event which should bring together colleagues, alumni, friends, scholars, writers, and members of the creative community across Dublin, across Ireland, and globally. My hope is that the annual lecture will become an essential feature in the academic calendar as a way of showcasing the collective excellence and value of the arts and humanities disciplines. And it's this collective endeavour, I think, that's important to me as the principal of the college. Because as you know, the college comprises 7 schools. It ranges across music, literature, drama, film, creative writing, languages, history, classics, history of art, and of course, for tonight, Irish, Celtic studies, and folklore. And one of the objectives for the annual lecture is that it is hosted each year by a different school, and of course, sponsored by the college, so I have to get that in. But then the idea was that the lectures themselves would speak to more than one school, though, more than one area and or historical period within the arts and humanities, and thus foster the kind of broader conversations about how our separate but related and mutually informing disciplines not only speak to each other, but also collectively as one voice. And the fight is now on for which school will host the lecture next year, and I'm deciding what ways I can do to sort of make sure that competition reaches its heights. But for this evening, I'm absolutely delighted to say that the inaugural college lecture for 2017 falls to the School of Irish, Celtic Studies and Folklore. And I'm even more excited to say that our inaugural speaker is Paul Muldoon, whose work and practice perfectly encapsulates the creative force which results from dialogues across and between linguistic, disciplinary, geographical and temporal boundaries. I'll now hand over to Regina Echolatan, Head of the School of Irish, Celtic Studies and Folklore, to introduce our inaugural speaker, Paul Muldoon. Thank you.
Guramahigat Sarah, agus Guramahigat Verfad, as a heart of Mahan Shahanacht, agus Kurum Falcha, War, Chriul, Rovanacht, Chief Shud the Gaelic Ogav, agus Chief Shud Ata Vagan Gaelic, agus Lori Much Berla, a Skoil na Gaelica, and Leon Helchi, agus and Villages Fasta. We also speak English. So we're delighted to reach out on this lecture, that we wanted to really ensure that we reached as broad an audience as we possibly could to showcase what is being done in the College of Arts and Humanities. I won't delay you because I'm conscious that we have a wonderful night ahead of us. So just to introduce Paul, Paul Muldoon was born in Portadown in 1951 and brought up near a village called the Moy on the border of counties Armagh and Tyrone, where he studied at Queen's University Belfast, and he met Séamas Heaney and also became associated with the Belfast group of poets. This group included Michael Longley, Kieran Carson, Maeve McGuickian and Frank Ormsby. And on that note, through the introductions tonight and meeting people on the way in, not only are some very renowned artists, scholars and poets here tonight, but many of Paul's friends from a long time ago, and they have come out tonight to be here to support his lecture and to be here in unison with this wonderful occasion. After working as an arts producer for the BBC in Belfast for 13 years, Paul Muldoon emigrated to the United States and has taught at Princeton University since 1987 and currently holds the Howard G.B. Clark 2021 University Professor in the Humanities at Princeton. He is the author of over 30 collections. Amongst his most notable, 1,000 Things Worth Knowing, Maggot, Horse Latitudes, Moy, Sand and Gravel, Hay, The Annals of Chile, Madoc, A Mystery, Meeting the British, Cuarta, Why Brownlee Left, Mules and New Weather. And tonight, after the lecture, we have the honour of him launching his own book on Lamentations, which will be on sale after this and signings available. More recently, Paul Muldoon has written rock lyrics for his own bands, Racket, Wayside Shrines and Rogue Oliphant, and which have been collected together in Songs and Sonnets and The Words on the Street. Paul Muldoon is the winner of the T.S. Eliot Prize, the Irish Times Literature Prize for Poetry, the Griffin Poetry Prize, and the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. He was also a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, was Oxford Professor of Poetry, and he is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Since the publication of his first collection, New Weather, in 1973, Muldoon's poetry is notable for the dialogue between prosodic, Gaelic and English worlds and the irrepressible syncretism that characterises Anglo-Irish literature. His oeuvre testifies to the coexistence of two distinct languages and cultures. The resultant commingling of different people, places and periods speaks to the possibility of dwelling comparatively in otherwise juxtaposed languages and cultures. In a time of increased nationalism and isolationalism in political debates surrounding citizenship and cultural histories, Muldoon's introduction to 18th century Ulster poetry will serve to highlight the importance of hybridity and syncretism over monoculturalism, and the need to recognise different cultures as integrated, not segregated, as coterminous, not anachronistic, always speaking to each other across both ideological and experiential borders for those who care to listen. An artist and scholar closely associated with the propagation of Gaelic culture at home and abroad over the last 50 years, Paul Muldoon perfectly encapsulates the value of understanding cultural continuums and the possible dialogues between different places, different people, and different periods. In this lecture, where he will focus on the poetry of Ó Doirnín, Cuarta and Cuarta, as poets hailing from the Urile tradition of poetry and song, his examination of the work of these acclaimed Ulster poets highlights the importance and influence of Irish manuscripts and indeed Irish language on the world stage. While the discussion is part of the rich literary tradition of Urile in the northeast of Ireland, it puts a spotlight on the significance of Irish language poetry in a global context. He is uniquely positioned to foreground the continued relevance of the arts and humanities, especially in the globalised 21st century. It is a great pleasure and a privilege for the School of Irish Celtic Studies and Folklore to host Paul Muldoon, and we couldn't imagine a more fitting scholar and artist to launch this lecture series now as the inaugural annual college lecture. I give you Paul Muldoon.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. In fact, I wonder now if I actually need to lecture at all. But it's a great honour to be here. Thank you so much for this wonderful invitation, and thank you for coming out. And as you may already have gleaned, what I'm hoping to do over the next hour or so is to focus on some aspects of the work of 5 of these 18th century Ulster poets: Séamas, Dall, Cuarta, Pádraig MacAlinden, Peadar Ó Doirnín, Séamas Mór McMurphy, and Art McCooey. And together they represent a tradition that is all but invisible, I think, even now, even to some enthusiasts of Gaelic poetry. Meanwhile, aspects of their work transcend the kind of jingoism that some enthusiasts of Gaelic poetry claim for it, and are more usefully viewed as being part of a wider and deeper European culture. Now, my objective is to give a necessarily partial, I don't necessarily have that as an objective, it's just part of the deal. It must be partial, given the time, and it must be peremptory, but to give some sense of the historical and literary context of these poets, and to make some claims for their significance. I'm not actually going to try to make too many claims. Since it is an inaugural lecture, I'm actually going to try just to set out or set down, float a few ideas, and see what happens. And along the way, I'll be touching on such topics as a dialogue by a dean, duration in poetry, Ian Dury, darkness, doggerel, Dryden, literary debts, daylight robbery. This is just the days. Dunreevy Wood, and the Department of Dirty Tricks. So, let's begin with a translation of a poem by Art McCooey. He was the last and perhaps in many ways the longest lasting of these poets. And this is probably his best known poem, Uirchilachregan. In English, I render it as the churchyard at Cregan. And it recounts a grand conversation between the poet and a spervan or sky woman. I'll read a little bit of it in Irish, if I may, given the circumstances. Uirchilachregan, sé chol mé réir fíomhrón. Is le hírí na mania, hanig anier familléin le poig. Bhí grís rua garheki, agus linear in a cave maror. Is gur bhíchlan se doin, bhí a gank ar an rian og. Now, when I say onk, you'll know I'm from the north. You'll know I'm from the north. In the churchyard at Cregan, I slept sad as sad last night, till a young girl came to me with a kiss at first light. What with her blush bright cheek and her hair's golden sheen, it did my heart good to gaze on that lovely young queen. O kind young gentleman, throw off your great sorrow load and get up and follow me down the road to one sweet country the English don't as yet hold in thrall, where music will lull you from hall to pleasure hall. O beautiful queen, are you Helen, for whom sloughs were slain, or one of the 9 muses of the Parnassian strain? In what land were you reared, O unclouded star, that the likes of myself might consort with your avatar? Don't ask me that question, for to this side of the Boyne I'm unreconciled, what with having been reared ne Graniog as a fairy child, I who elicited in their bard halls the bard's most lucid tones of an evening in Tara, and by morning in deepest Tyrone. I'm reading this. I'm going to read the whole thing, if you don't mind, just to get a sense of where we are in this. That the O'Neills of Tyrone have left us is my deepest heart stab, while their branch in the fuse are restless under their slabs. Those who never turned their backs on the barns like Neil Frassach's fresh-faced crew, but shard us with clothes at Christmas in exchange for a verse or two. Since the rout of the tribes at Ochram and the Boyne, worse luck, the Irish who've always stuck by their poets have themselves become unstuck. Wouldn't you be better off in a fairy fort with me by your flank than have Williamite arrows hitting your heart point blank? I wouldn't leave for all the gold that went with the kings to their mounds. I'm loath to leave my friends who are still above ground. Never mind my wife, to whom I promised so much when she was young. Were I to desert her now, I know she'd be sorrow-stung. You don't have a single relative who's still alive and well. You're piss-poor, penniless, a hollow-eyed hallion without a hope in hell. Wouldn't you be better off with a girl with a soft touch than have these so-and-sos come down hard on your poems as such? That as such, I think, actually probably smacks a little too much of Cork, but it's there. Oh, beautiful young queen, though falling for you's been my fate, I won't go down that road unless you stipulate that, be it on the Shannon, the Isle of Man, or in Egypt, I die. It's in my own sweet-smelling churchyard at Cregan I lie. Now, the ambition and attack of this poem are truly remarkable. How deftly the political and social contexts are summoned. The Neil Frassach, who's mentioned, of course, was King of Ireland between 774, 778, descendant of Niall or Neil of the Nine Hostages, the 5th century king, an ancestor of the O'Neills of the Fews, and that's, of course, the wooded barony of South Armagh that corresponds roughly to the parish of Cregan. It's in the churchyard at Cregan that the O'Neills, traditional benefactors of the Gaelic poets, are buried. Indeed, the leader of the family, Daniel O'Neill, would be interred there in 1773, the same year as Art McCooey's own bones were buried there. I use the term shard in my translation by way of playful reference to the etymology of frasach, and showering, and in ironic comment on the lack of patronage now afforded the likes of Art McCooey. The word frasach meaning, as I say, of the showers, referring to 3 showers of honey, silver, and blood that fell when Neil or Niall was born. The O'Neills of the Fews were exiled after the failure of the 1641 uprising. Their lands were eventually taken over by a character whom we'll meet a few times during the course of the next 50 minutes, Johnson of the Fews, the Scottish soldier who served as chief constable of the region for 49 years, between 1710 and 1759. And in the service book of Colonel Nassau's Regiment of Foot, dated April 28, 1716, we read the following. Sergeant Wilde of this corps stood for duty with 6 men at the redoubt of Black Bank in the Fews and at the command of Mr. Johnson, the constable of that wild country. Struck fear in the natives who called for the popish pretender. We razed their cabins, that's R-A-Z-E-D, or Z-E-D, their cabins to the ground, and whipped the curs who cursed us in their Irish jargon. That Irish jargon in which the Kerrs were cursing was almost indistinguishable from Captain John Johnson's native Scots Gaelic, which gave him an entree to the ways of the local Tories, in particular the local highwaymen, of which the place abounded. And the locals' command of English was nonetheless improving, to the extent that they were able to come up with a rhyme about this infamous Tory hunter. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, save us from Johnson, King of the Fews. It was into this milieu, I like saying that, it was into this milieu in which Johnson had already been at the helm for 30 years that Art McCooey was born. And that was in 1738. It's a little question as to exactly when he was born. Some give it a bit earlier. 5 years after the publication of Jonathan Swift's A Pastoral Dialogue, which he prefaces as follows: a nymph and swain, Sheila and Dermot hight, i.e. named, who wont to weed the court of Gosford night, while each with stubbed knife removed the roots that raised between the stones their daily shoots. It's the kind of stuff that gives you hope, actually, in the poetry business. As at their work they sat in counter-view, with mutual passion smit, with mutual beauty smit, their passion grew. Sing, heavenly muse, in sweetly flowing strain, the soft endearments of the nymph and swain. So the Gosford night there is, of course, one of the Atchisons of Market Hill, whose manor house Swift had visited and whose gardens apparently he had helped design in his spare time. And it's in these gardens, indeed, that Dermot and Sheila exchanged their soft endearments. I'm going to read a bit of this just to give you a sense of what else was happening on the dialogue front, right, in the English tradition. Dermot, my love to Sheila is more firmly fixed than strongest weeds that grow these stones betwixt. My spud these nettles from the stones can part, no knife so keen to weed thee from my heart. Sheila, my love for gentle Dermot faster grows than yon tall dock that rises to my nose. Cut down the dock, 'twill sprout again, but oh, love rooted out again will never grow. Dermot, no more than briar thy tender leg shall rake. I spare the thistle for Sir Arthur's sake. Sir Arthur Atchison, sharp are the stones, take thou this rushy mat, the hardest bum will bruise from sitting squat. Sheila, thy breeches torn behind stand gaping wide. We know we're in the presence of the great Dean here. This petticoat shall save thy dear backside. Nor need I blush, although you feel it wet. Dermot, I vow, 'tis nothing else but sweat. So, the Reverend Swift's irreverent rhymes are based on a long tradition of dialogue poems, including several, of course, by Andrew Marvell, of course, John Gay's The Shepherd's Week, 1714. It's a tradition that draws heavily on Virgil's eclogues, familiar to some of these poets in Latin, because many of them spoke Latin or read it, but translated into English by Dryden as recently as 1697. Meliboeus, I envy not your fortune, but admire that while the raging sword and wasteful fire destroy the wretched neighbourhood around, no hostile arms approach your happy ground. Far different is my fate. My feeble goats with pains I drive from their forsaken coats. Just to give you a sense of that tradition of the conversation, I'll to tireless freedom which came at length, though slow to come, nor did my search of liberty begin till my black hairs were changed upon my chin, nor Amaryllis would vouchsafe a look till Galatea's meaner bonds I broke. These references to the characters from Greek mythology, that till then a helpless, hopeless, homely swain, I sought not freedom nor aspired to gain. Though many a victim from my foals was brought, and many a cheese to country markets brought, yet all the little that I got I spent, and still returned as empty as I went. So the patois of these two Armagh potato weeders is rendered by Swift, back to Swift now, with remarkable spunk and spirit. Dermot, at an old stubborn toot I chanced to tug when the Dean threw me this tobacco plug. A longer hipworth never did I see. This, dearest Sheila, thou shalt share with me. Sheila, in at the pantry door this morn I slipped, and from the shelf a charming crust I whipped. Dennis was out, and I got hither safe. And thou, my dear, shalt have the bigger half. What a relationship. Dermot, then when you saw Teddy at Long Bullets play, you sat and loused him. De-loused, in other words, him all the sunshine day. How could you, Sheila, listen to his tales or crack such lice as his betwixt your nails? So the game of long bullets or road bowls was probably not much played in the vicinity of the redoubt at Black Bank, given the dangers besetting travellers in the early 1730s. It's a game that's still played up in that part of the world, as you know, and also in County Cork as such. It seems that Jonathan Swift was given safe passage on his way from Dublin to visit the Gosford Knight, as he calls him, by none other than our friend John Johnson, King of the Fews. And it also seems likely that the Dean must have been familiar with something of the literary milieu of Cregan. We know from Thomas O'Fee, the single greatest scholar of McCooey, that, quote, more than any other poet of the 18th century, McCooey is the poet par excellence of Cregan and of the O'Neill family of Glasdrummin. He was probably born in the townland of Ballinahy, Mount Hill as it's known, now named after the local Protestant clergyman, of which more anon, or of whom more anon, and educated at a local hedge school, where he gained a good knowledge of Irish mythology, Irish history, and, of course, classical literature. It would seem that McCooey's sense of Irish history and folklore came from Geoffrey Keating, Seachra na Cetinach, a version of whose Forras Fassa or Erin had been published in English in 1723, but was in circulation in Irish, of course, by way of manuscript copy, though sub rosa. Peadar Ó Doirnín, and we'll come to a little later, may himself have been responsible, indeed, for one of these samizdat versions of Forras Fassa. Keating's great contribution had been to give the Gael a lineage that traced their progress from Egypt to Scythia, from Scythia to Crete, from Crete to Spain, from Spain to Ireland. Is actually pretty accurate, I think, in terms of modern DNA research. And that's partly why the idea of dying in Egypt would have represented a real homecoming for Art McCooey. This lineage was important above all because it affirmed that the Irish were a sovereign nation who are hardly meant to be held in thrall by another power. The iconography associated with the claims of James II, quite recently deposed and defeated, of course, by his son-in-law, William of Orange, were transferred to the claims of his son, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, as in this anonymous song. Upon a fine morning for soft recreation, I heard a fair lady making much moan, sighing and sobbing with sad lamentation, and saying, "My blackbird most royal has flown." Very similar, actually, to a song called The Boys of Mullabon, which some of you may know. "My thoughts, they deceive me, reflections degrave me, and I'm o'erburdened with sad misery. But if death should blind me, as true love inclines me, my blackbird I'll seek out wherever he be." Now this song, that's just one verse of it, dates to about 1715, the year of the failed Jacobite rebellion, or a failed Jacobite rebellion, the year of the parting between him and the Fair Lady of Ireland. And it seems to have had some currency in Ireland, and it's included in the Field Day Anthology of Irish Literature, for example. Now, I'll come back to Art McCooey later, but for the moment I'll take my cue from the socio-political charge of that song, The Blackbird, and look at a poem or two by Séamas Dall Cuarta. Now, he's the earliest, he's 1650 to 1733, the earliest of these 5 poets I'm touching on today. His poems are raw, in a sense, redolent of a great sense of failure and loss on both the national and local fronts. MacCurtha's name might be rendered in English, if we felt inclined to do that. We don't have to, but I'm going to, as Blind James Courtney or Blind Jimmy McCourt, which makes him sound like an old Chicago blues man. And that might indeed be an instructive way of thinking about him. He was, after all, a singer of poems who lived much of his life on the edge. Declan Kybert describes his predicament rather succinctly. He writes, "His mindset was formed before the defeat of James at the Boyne, and so he believed that patronage was due to a poet even as he lived a reality which was very different." Blind Jimmy McCourt was an almost, would you like some water? There? Blind Jimmy McCourt, an almost exact contemporary of Blind Turlough O'Carolan, the composer who lost his sight by smallpox at the age of 18, went on to have a career as an itinerant harper, of course. Blind Jimmy McCourt, also a rough contemporary of the English poet, pamphleteer and historian, Blind Johnny Milton, best known for his epic work Paradise Lost, originally issued in 1667, which he wrote after losing his sight to untreated glaucoma. But blindness was extremely common in Ireland, and indeed beyond, in the 17th and 18th centuries, largely because of the effects of smallpox, of course, a disease that spread rapidly largely because of the unsanitary conditions in which most of the population lived. And these conditions extended into the 19th century and beyond, actually. I know I had relatives who lived in conditions not dissimilar from these. And S. Reynolds Hole, as he's known, the Dean of Rochester, has a little tour of Ireland, 1896, where he writes, and this would have been truer, if anything, 100 years before, "The miserable huts of the peasantry, seen by the feeble light, which comes through the doorway and smoke hole. To talk about chimneys would be an insult to architecture. Give one the idea, not so much that the pigs have got into the parlour, but that the family have migrated to the sty. And there's maybe a little bit of edge to this, but, on the other hand, it's not inaccurate. An unpaved clay floor, a roof of straw and weeds, dank, soaked and rotting overhead, a miserable bed in the corner. This is how many of our ancestors lived. We've sort of forgotten about this. An iron pot over a peat fire are the principal items of the property. Before the door is a sink, black and filthy, for the refuse, yet the inmates look hale and happy. Maybe just beyond what one would hope to see. And the thought at once suggests itself how much might be accomplished by such a people awaking to assert its dignity and to discharge its duty. Slightly problematic and patronising, but something to it. Now, the hamlet of Corrickit, in the vicinity of Ravensdale, was made up of just such houses, though I think it's fair to say that the inmates were anything but hale and happy. Ugnach sin tia Corrickit is ugnach aver is vra. Is the wages or is fin, cha jig ein jiv e gan chach. They're mean, these cottages in Corrickit. Mean, they're men and women. Even if they were heaped with gold and wine, they'd not extend a welcome. They'd not extend a welcome for the whole world's treasure, for all the riches in creation. In this, they're just like badgers. Just like badgers, they go to ground and dig through darkness night and day. For all the riches in creation, they'd not extend a welcome. The buck badger cares not for gaiety, nor glee, nor fun and games. The hunan leis an rívroch evenes atches na sport, the hunan yo si drí na commodore ceol, the hunan yo Séamas cech na cuidiú nail og, is fanu gach ein mar a míd ag tochelt and for. The buck badger cares not for gaiety, nor glee, nor fun and games. The badgers care not for sage, nor seer, nor singer of lays. They care not for blind Séamas, nor the company of young Nile. May they all be forced to stay, clawing their way through the clay. This is a curse poem, a hangover from the bardic era in which the poet had the capacity to engage in 10 different types of satire, as you'll recall. And nothing has changed, by the way, including glam dickens, which had the power to raise such blisters on a victim's face as might vie with the pustules associated with smallpox. The Irish bard might expect to be paid, and indeed the Welsh bard, paid for his or her praise poems in horses or cattle or feather cloaks, which is a touch I must say I'm sorry to see seems to have gone. There is no such largesse in Corrickit. The lumbering aspect of the badger, an animal that has the potential, by the way, in mythology, folklore to shapeshift into a human, in at least one Irish story, is beautifully in sync with the lumbering line, may they all be forced to stay, clawing their way through the clay. Now, according to the National Museum of Ireland, and always go along with them. Prior to the 20th century, most people used either stone or clay to build the walls of their home. Stone was preferred because of its durability, but it was not locally, if it was not locally available, clay, mud served instead. Stone was more readily available in the northwest, while clay predominated in the east and southeast. But homes made of each type of material were found throughout the island. Walls were often covered with a layer of whitewash made from lime or seashells. And this whitewash is at the very heart of the next poem by Séamas Dall Cuarta. And inaugural is fada the chun taresh dar. Is nachlin isle the chinna féin to a kina de spray taresh awash. The Drowned Blackbird. O beautiful daughter of Con O'Neill, you've slept long after your great loss. Don't let your noble kinsmen hear you wail for your one precious thing amid all the dross. The music of that lively, lightsome bird has gone from you. My bright seagull, all gone. But there's a silver lining to every cloud. Leave off your hand claps and ullagons. From your hand claps and howls of grief, hold off, my little chickabiddy. O beautiful daughter of Con O'Neill, on a common bird, don't waste your pity. My pretty one that sprang from Ulster's high kings, compose yourself lest you go out of your mind for the sake of a bird, albeit the sweetest that sings. It's washed white now, see, in a bucket of lime. Now, the blackbird associated with the Stuarts in that song of 1715, also associated now with the Unail, another royal lineage that is all but sunk without trace. The blackbird undergoes a perverse baptism, perhaps even a beatification. And the subject matter of the mourning of a pet may send some readers back to Catullus and Lesbia's sparrow. But this particular bird also has a long Irish literary heritage ranging from the 9th century, and please forgive my pronunciation. I mean, my modern Irish is bad enough, but we hear this. Ent en bec rolek fed dorin whip lan weed. For herfaj oslach lag lun de graaf can we. And then, of course, we've got the 15th or 16th century Lun Derrian Charn. And by the way, the text of these are outside on the, of one of them certainly outside on the beautiful poster just outside the door. Now, another feature of both Corachich and in Landu Bacha is their somewhat broken-backed form, one that reflects the broken-backed culture from which they derive, an odd combination of fracture and fusion. The form of tree ring agus oran wells those three opening stanzas based on the syllabic metrics of the bardic system to a fourth stanza based on the accentuated metrics of popular song. Its length is 16 lines, essentially the same as a sonnet. If one thinks of a sonnet as having less to do with dimension than duration. In both cases, they rhyme. Now, we can see from that 9th century Loch Leg, even in my reading of it, that the Irish were rhymers par excellence. And this has been true as far back as the 7th century. The stanza pattern of Loch Lage has been so durable as to continue to be used in songs. And I knew you were wondering how I was going to get this in. Ian Dury's Reasons to be Cheerful, Part 3. Summer, Buddy Holly, The Working Folly, Good Golly Miss Molly, and Boats. Hammersmith Pally, The Bolshoi Ballet, Jump Back in the Alley, and Nanny Goats. Same thing, in essence. It does seem to be increasingly accepted that the convention of rhyme that developed in medieval European literature, I hope I'm not treading on anyone's toes around here, stemmed from the Irish poetic tradition. Yeah! There's a huge hinterland behind even that piece of doggerel about Johnson, King of the Fuse. Could never have happened without that blackbird and other things. And it's worth saying a word or two about the bardic system from which those first 3 stanzas derive. And I appeal, if I may, to the great description given by Osborne Bergen in his 1912 lecture to the National Literary Society in Dublin. Bardic poetry of any period is, this is such wonderful stuff, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Bardic poetry of any period is easily distinguished by its form. A great deal of it is not really what a modern critic would call poetry in the higher sense. But though it may lack inspiration, it is never wanting in artistic finish. For we must remember that the Irish file or bard was not necessarily an inspired poet. That he could not help. He was, in fact, a professor of literature and a man of letters, highly trained in the use of a polished literary medium, belonging to a hereditary caste in an aristocratic society, and holding an official position therein by virtue of his training, his learning, his knowledge of the history and traditions of his country and his clan. He discharged, as John O'Donovan pointed out many years ago, the functions of the modern journalist. He was not a songwriter, public official, chronicler, political essayist. Belonged to the hereditary caste. The Gaelic poet, we may say, had to be both born and made. Both born and made. In the same way, the professions of history, law, and medicine were confined to certain families. So in his 1912 lecture, which is reprinted or printed as the introduction to his great study of Irish bardic poetry, Bergen includes a long description of the training in the bardic schools. They go into these darkened rooms, if you recall. The structure was a snug, I'm going to skip through this, low hot beds in it at convenient distances, each within a small apartment without much furniture of any kind, save only a table, some seats, and a conveniency for cloths or clothes to hang upon. No windows to let in the day, nor any light at all used but that of candles, and these brought in at a proper season only. It was in what Sir Philip Sidney referred to as a chamber deaf to noise and blind to light, that blind Jimmy Courtney would have been very much at ease. The dorchadis icha lay, the world in which there are no windows to let in the day, and through which the badgers of Corrickit are scratching and scrabbling, is paradoxically the very milieu that suits their bard kin. So they come out, they get this, the bards, having first did the composition from him, got it. The poet himself said nothing, but directed and took care that everyone else did his part right. What a job. And the bards, having first had the composition from it, got it well by heart, and now pronounced it orderly, keeping even pace with a harp, touched upon that occasion, no other musical instrument being allowed for the said purpose than this alone, as being masculine, much sweeter and fuller than any other. And this is likely, actually, some version of this is how a poem like An Londu Báite, was presented to an audience to the accompaniment of a steel-strung harp or something like it. The harp, by the way, another import from Egypt, where it was developed about 2500 BC. The sense of the Celtic world, and predominantly the Welsh bardic world, would inspire Thomas Gray's poem, The Bard, published in 1757, which itself inspired a new way of thinking about poetry and indeed redefined the image of what a poet might be and perhaps even look like. On a rock whose haughty brow frowns o'er old Conways. Nice to get Conway in there. Yeah, foaming flood, robed in the sable garb of woe, with haggard eyes the poet stood, jet-lagged probably. Loose his bare beard and hoary hair streamed like a meteor in the troubled air, and with a master's hand and prophet's fire struck the deep sorrows of his lyre. Now this is the same Thomas Gray, you'll recall, who composed the ode on the death of a favourite cat, drowned in a tub of goldfishes. Poem dating from 1747, a good 14 years after Macuirta's death. 'Twas on a lofty vase's side, where China's gayest art had dyed the azure flowers that blow, demurest of the tabby kind. The pensive Selima reclined, gazed on the lake below. Still had she gazed, but midst the tide 2 angel forms were seen to glide, the genii of the stream. Their scaly armours, Tyrian hue, through richest purple to the view, betrayed a golden gleam. So she hops in there and, of course, is drowned. Now, I don't want to belabour a point that I'm not quite able to prove, though it's really never stopped me before. But I do want to suggest that this mock heroic tone, certainly very much of a piece with An Londu Báise, with subject matter strikingly similar. The mock heroic, of course, at the heart of both these poems, introduced to English readers by Pope in The Rape of the Lock. Now, before I leave Séamas Dall Macuirta, I do want to point to another somewhat humorous feature of both Cuarta and An Londu Báise, and as well as their mock heroic aspect. And that's, of course, the weakness for wordplay in general and for the pun in particular. However raw these poems might be, they are constructed with a remarkable rigour. In Cuarta, for example, there's a play on the relationship between, as far as I'm concerned, between the word ugnach, meaning lonely or desolate or mean, as I translate it there, and the word oi, meaning grave or vault or den, such as a badger might inhabit. There's also fun to be had with the similarities between the words cach, meaning each or all, and cich, meaning blind, both in the sense of sightless and the sense of the window treatment, or lack of it, drawn by the people of Cuarta. At least they're getting into their houses to shut out the bard. One implication might be that all the inhabitants of Cuarta, like all badgers, are blind for at least part of their lives. In An Londu Báise, the term Londu itself is a near version of linden, the main component in the name Padraig MacAlinden, 1665, 1733. Little bit of a stretch, but I do think, this is what's there. Yeah, the word coa, for example, is used in a number of these poems. Little side references, I think, nods and winks in one poet in the direction of the other, in the way that there won't. And MacAlinden was, according to Ciarán Ó Doifín, in the Irish language in County Down, there's some question about where MacAlinden, or Linden as he was known actually, Linden. He was well educated, for he spoke his native language to perfection. He spoke French, Spanish, Latin, Greek, and he understood Hebrew and some of the Oriental languages. He had also read such English poets as Sir Philip Sidney, Thomas Campion. Now here's one of Macalindon's versions, his ventures, forays into English. Now there lives a dame that might save Queen Hecuba's harms and spare the sundry nations the pains they then took to arms. Atrides still could ease Iphigenia from her sad alarms, if Artemis was there among the fair with her blooming charms. And that's the kind of thing that can go wrong quite easily. It sounds like a parody of Dryden. In fact, half unarrayed he ran to his relief, so hasty and so artless was his grief. Approaching greatness, met him out with her charms of power and future state, but looked so ghastly to a brother's fate, he shook her from his arms. That's Dryden. Anyway, in just the way that O'Carolan was exposed to Vivaldi, Corelli, music he would have heard in the homes of some of his patrons, was influenced by them in his own work, so poets like Cuarta and Macalindon were influenced by models beyond their immediate ken. Now, according to Pádraigín, I'm moving on a little bit, Pádraigín ní Húlaháin, who's a great scholar of this, writes, it was Linden, and his name had, his Gaelic name had been more or less lost, who kept alive the lingering spirit of poetry and music. And it was owing to his example that the Fuse, Down and Louth produced so large a number of truly learned bards and musicians at this and at subsequent periods. Frequent emery or bardic contentions were held in his house and under his inspection. Owing to the rigour of the penal laws, several bards could not commit their compositions to writing, but the learned and patriotic Linden corrected where necessary and copied them. Hence he was usually called Racador na Mard, a repetitor of poets, and he reputedly held a school of poetry and harp playing at Chumhaigh Vicainte, Killen Hill, just outside Dundalk, where as many as 18 poets and literary people would assemble there. That's Pádraigín ní Húlaháin. This is the same Chumhaigh Vicainte that we know from the best known, the best poem, indeed by Peadar Ó Doirnín. O beautiful woman with shiny flowing locks, stay with me for a while at least. Now clerics, commoners and the quality are all fast asleep under their white sheets. For we'll be together far from them as tomorrow's sun remakes its mould, safe and sound in airy isolation at Céin Vicainte's old stronghold, Chumhaigh Vicainte. Now, one of Peadar Ó Doirnín's closest friends, Séamas McMurphy, I think I'll skip past that. He fell foul of Johnson of the Fuse through a dirty trick, actually, that was played on him by a woman called Molly McDecker and her father, who persuaded Johnson that McMurphy had written a poem satirising Johnson. And in fact, it had been written by Ó Doirnín, whom they'd got drunk. It's a complex story. But, you know, drink is a major component in it, it seems. And he was sentenced to death. He composed a poem as he waited for his appointment with the gallows. Da méinar war arde nor war arden aden, no magas ranjehe os chanje gach grenje, de Jane mar londo, go kilje don reve, gus hart go carnally, mar togo Lorraine me. If only I could live out my days in Bar Arda or Fathom, as a bracken frond with the sun on my face, or fly like a blackbird to the woods of Donravy and round to Carnally, my ancestors' home place. So this blackbird is a quick, chirpy reincarnation of Cuarta's quick-limed, calcified Lundu. As for McMurphy's own body, it was left hanging for 3 days before it was taken down, waked for 2 nights, buried in Cregan churchyard. Which brings us neatly back, and we're in the home straight here, you'll be glad to know, to Art McCooey. According to tradition, Art's mismanaged his finances early on, as it were. He spent his life working as a labourer, a gardener. He wanted to marry his second cousin, Mary Lamb, but Father Quinn, parish priest of Cregan, refused to perform the marriage, of course, insisting that they were much too close, the forbidden degrees of kindred. So Art had it performed in Cregan Church by his longtime employer, the Reverend Hugh Hill. He was excommunicated. He went down to, as so many do, Howth. And, why wouldn't he? He went down to Howth, and of course it was in Howth that he wrote his most famous poem, Aisling Art Vicui. A cún vin adar, a ruach na heron, smear chiv ton na woch na malí, hannig Aisling vel vin gan is echinch, in astje Venus no a glá banshee. As I lay out by Howth Harbour on the edge of Erin, as I lay out by the ocean side, a sweet-mouthed vision would take me unawares in the guise of some Venus or fairy bride. She told me 100 men of the native-born gentry had risen up from their cold, cold graves, and the O'Neills were once more alive and free to collect from the fews their gold tribute and tithes. The phoenix, he refers to the phoenix rising again. Tama chrisha revha in a vilja céad chuid. My heart is in 100,000 bits, all burst and broken, and there's no balm that will give me relief when I hear the Irish language everywhere forsaken and a trala of English in everyone's mouth. Willie and Jane Wally and Jane are taking out long lets on those great tracts of Ireland so steeped in history. And if ever I inquire about it, there's only one answer I get. Thou art a papist. I know not thee. So anyway, after a year or so, Art McCooey's excommunication revoked, and the marriage dispensation granted. Art comes back to Cregan. He seems to have spent his last few years working as a cowherd on a farm at Tullyard, and he died there on January 5th, 1773. The tradition that had been all but extinguished with Cuarta's blackbird now rose again with McCooey's phoenix, another Egyptian import, by the way, found its way into the Aisling, that Aisling in particular, which will surely live as long as poetry, be it in Gaelic or English, is read. Thank you so much.